So here we are, the moment everyone's been waiting for. After months of headlines, speculation, and endless coverage, the jury has finally reached their verdict in the trial of Sean Diddy Combs. And let me tell you, this is one of those moments that's going to send shockwaves through the entertainment industry and beyond. Now, before we dive into the details of this verdict, I want to be clear about something. This isn't just another celebrity trial. This isn't just another moment of tabloid drama. What we're witnessing here is a seismic shift in how the entertainment industry handles power, accountability, and justice. The implications of this verdict extend far beyond one man, far beyond one courtroom, and they're going to reshape conversations about celebrity culture for years to come. But first, let's talk about how we got here. Because to understand the weight of this verdict, you need to understand the journey that brought us to this moment. Sean Combs, known to the world as Diddy, Puff Daddy, P. Diddy, whatever name he was going by at the time, has been a titan in the music industry for decades. We're talking about a man who built an empire. Record labels, fashion lines, vodka brands, restaurants. This wasn't just a rapper or a producer. This was a businessman who had his fingers in every pie you could imagine. The charges against Combs were serious. Extremely serious. We're talking about racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. These aren't the kind of charges that get thrown around lightly. These are federal charges that carry the weight of decades behind bars. The kind of charges that make people disappear from public life forever. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who used his power, his wealth, and his influence to create what they called a criminal enterprise. They alleged that Combs ran a network that engaged in sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The government claimed this wasn't just about individual acts of wrongdoing. They argued this was about a systematic pattern of abuse that spanned years, maybe even decades. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about allegations that go back to the height of his career, when he was throwing those legendary parties in the Hamptons, when he was walking red carpets with the biggest names in entertainment, when he was building business partnerships with some of the most powerful people in the world. The prosecution argued that behind all of that glamour, behind all of that success, there was something much darker happening. The defense naturally told a completely different story. They painted Combs as a successful businessman who became a target because of his wealth and his prominence. They argued that the government was trying to criminalize what they called consensual adult behavior. They claimed that prosecutors were taking normal business practices and twisting them into something sinister. They suggested that people were coming forward with allegations because they saw an opportunity to cash in on a wealthy man's downfall. The trial itself was a spectacle. We're talking about months of testimony, hundreds of pieces of evidence, and witnesses whose stories ranged from heartbreaking to absolutely shocking. The prosecution brought forward alleged victims who described years of abuse, manipulation, and coercion. They presented evidence of what they called freak-offs, elaborate sexual performances that Combs allegedly orchestrated and recorded. They showed the jury financial records, travel documents, and communications that they said proved their case. But here's where it gets really interesting. The defense didn't just deny the allegations, they went on the offensive, they questioned the credibility of witnesses. They suggested that people were motivated by money, by fame, by the opportunity to bring down a powerful man. They argued that the government was using its vast resources to prosecute someone whose real crime was being successful while black in America. The celebrity factor in this trial was impossible to ignore. We're talking about someone who had been photographed with presidents, who had been a fixture at the most exclusive parties in the world, who had business relationships with some of the biggest names in entertainment. The prosecution argued that this network of relationships wasn't just about friendship or business. They claimed it was part of a system that enabled and protected criminal behavior. Throughout the trial, we heard testimony about parties that weren't just parties. The prosecution described events where drugs were allegedly used to incapacitate victims, where people were allegedly coerced into sexual acts, where recordings were allegedly made for the purpose of blackmail and control. They painted a picture of a man who used his influence to create situations where people felt they had no choice but to comply with his demands. The defense countered by arguing that the government was criminalizing the lifestyle of a wealthy entertainer. They said that what prosecutors were calling coercion was actually just the normal dynamics of relationships in the entertainment industry. They argued that people who attended these parties did so willingly, that any sexual activity was consensual, and that the government was trying to rewrite history to fit their narrative. One of the most compelling aspects of this trial was how it intersected with broader conversations about power and accountability in the entertainment industry. This isn't happening in a vacuum. We've seen similar cases involving other powerful figures. We've seen movements like Me Too that have changed how we think about consent, about power dynamics, about the responsibility that comes with influence. The prosecution repeatedly emphasized that this case was about more than just individual acts. They argued that Combs created and maintained what they called a criminal enterprise. Under federal racketeering laws, that means they had to prove that there was an ongoing organization that engaged in a pattern of criminal activity. They had to show that this wasn't just about isolated incidents, but about a systematic approach to criminal behavior. The evidence presented during the trial was extensive and, frankly, disturbing. We heard about alleged victims who said they were drugged without their knowledge. We heard about people who said they were threatened if they tried to speak out. We heard about financial arrangements that prosecutors argued were designed to maintain control over victims. We heard about recordings that were allegedly made without consent and used as leverage. But the defense consistently pushed back on the interpretation of this evidence. They argued that the government was taking normal business practices and casting them in the worst possible light. They said that financial arrangements were legitimate business transactions. They argued that any recordings were made with full consent. They suggested that the government was asking the jury to criminalize behavior that, while perhaps unusual, wasn't actually illegal. The jury had to navigate through months of testimony, thousands of pieces of evidence, and competing narratives about what really happened. They had to decide whether the government had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Sean Combs was the leader of a criminal enterprise. They had to determine whether the evidence supported the specific charges of sex trafficking and racketeering. This wasn't just a trial about one man's guilt or innocence. This was a trial about power, about accountability, about what happens when wealth and influence intersect with allegations of criminal behavior. The outcome of this case was always going to send a message, one way or another, about how our justice system handles cases involving powerful, wealthy defendants. The implications of this verdict extend far beyond the courtroom. We're talking about a case that could influence how prosecutors approach similar cases in the future. We're talking about a verdict that could change how the entertainment industry thinks about power dynamics, about the responsibility that comes with influence, about the systems that have historically protected powerful people from consequences. Throughout this trial, we've seen how celebrity status can be both a shield and a target. The defense argued that Combs was being prosecuted because he was famous and wealthy, that he was an easy target for prosecutors looking to make a name for themselves. The prosecution's case against Sean Combs painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning decades, but let me break down exactly what evidence they presented and why it matters for understanding this verdict. Prosecutors didn't just throw accusations at the wall hoping something would stick. They built their case methodically, starting with what they called a pattern of behavior that stretched back to the early 2000s. The government argued that Combs used his entertainment empire as a cover for what they termed a criminal enterprise, and they had documentation to back up these claims. The financial records alone told a compelling story. Prosecutors presented evidence of payments that they argued were designed to silence victims and witnesses. We're talking about wire transfers, NDAs backed by substantial financial penalties, and what appeared to be systematic payoffs. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of what the prosecution characterized as a deliberate strategy to maintain control and avoid accountability. But here's where it gets really interesting from a legal perspective. The prosecution didn't rely solely on financial evidence. They presented testimony from multiple accusers, and this is where the case either lived or died. In high-profile cases like this, victim testimony can be incredibly powerful, but it's also vulnerable to attacks on credibility. The defense team, led by some of the most expensive legal talent money can buy, came out swinging with a completely different narrative. They argued that Combs was being targeted specifically because of his success, his wealth, and his prominence in the entertainment industry. This isn't just standard rich guy defense tactics. They were making a calculated argument that the prosecution was criminalizing behavior that, while perhaps morally questionable, was ultimately consensual adult conduct. The defense strategy was particularly clever in how they framed the power dynamics. Yes, they acknowledged that Combs had significant influence and wealth, but they argued that this didn't automatically make every interaction coercive or criminal. They pushed back hard on the prosecution's characterization of systematic abuse, instead painting a picture of opportunistic accusers motivated by financial gain. What made this case especially complex was the intersection of celebrity culture and legal proceedings. The jury had to navigate not just the evidence presented in court, but the broader cultural conversation about power, consent, and accountability that's been happening for years now. The Me Too movement fundamentally changed how these cases are perceived and prosecuted, and that context was impossible to ignore. The recorded evidence became absolutely crucial to both sides. Prosecutors presented audio recordings that they argued demonstrated coercive behavior and threats. But the defense fought back by questioning the context of these recordings, arguing that snippets of conversations taken out of context don't tell the full story of complex adult relationships. The trafficking charges were particularly serious because they carry mandatory minimum sentences and represent some of the most severe penalties in the federal criminal code. The prosecution had to prove not just that inappropriate conduct occurred, but that it crossed the line into criminal trafficking. That's a high bar, and it required showing that force, fraud, or coercion were used to compel commercial sex acts. What's fascinating about this case is how it reflects broader changes in how we think about consent and power dynamics. The prosecution argued that Combs's position in the entertainment industry created inherent coercion, that people couldn't truly consent when their careers and livelihoods were potentially at stake. The defense countered that this logic would criminalize virtually any intimate relationship involving successful people. The jury deliberation process in cases like this is incredibly intense. These jurors had to weigh months of testimony, thousands of pages of documents, and hours of recorded evidence. They had to separate what they might have heard in the media from what was actually proven in court. They had to decide not just what happened, but whether what happened constituted criminal behavior beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict ultimately came down to credibility. Did the jury believe the prosecution's narrative of systematic abuse and criminal enterprise? Or did they buy the defense argument that this was a case of prosecutorial overreach targeting a successful black entrepreneur? The answer to that question has implications far beyond just this case. The entertainment industry has been watching this trial incredibly closely because the outcome sets precedents for how similar cases might be handled in the future. If the prosecution succeeded in securing convictions, it sends a message that wealth and celebrity status won't protect against accountability for criminal behavior. If the defense prevailed, it might embolden others to fight similar charges more aggressively. The broader cultural implications are equally significant. This case became a lightning rod for discussions about race, wealth, power, and justice in America. Combs' supporters argued that he was being unfairly targeted, while critics said that his prosecution was long overdue. The jury had to tune out all that noise and focus solely on the evidence presented in court. The impact on the music industry specifically cannot be overstated. Sean Combs wasn't just another celebrity. He was a mogul who helped shape hip-hop culture and launched countless careers. His business empire touched everything from music production to fashion to media. The verdict affects not just him personally, but potentially the entire ecosystem of businesses and artists connected to his ventures. What makes this case particularly significant is how it demonstrates the evolution of the justice system's approach to these types of allegations. 20 years ago, cases like this might never have been brought to trial. The combination of changing cultural attitudes, enhanced federal trafficking laws, and increased willingness of victims to come forward has created an environment where even the most powerful figures can face serious criminal consequences. The investigative techniques used in this case were also noteworthy. Federal investigators used sophisticated financial analysis, digital forensics, and coordinated witness interviews to build their case. As the jury's verdict was read aloud in that Manhattan courtroom, the ripple effects began immediately. But here's what most people don't understand about high-profile verdicts like this one. The real story isn't just what happened in that courtroom. It's what happens next. And trust me, what comes after a verdict like this is where things get really interesting. The moment those 12 jurors delivered their decision, they didn't just determine Sean Combs's fate. They essentially rewrote the playbook for how celebrity criminal cases will be handled moving forward. Because here's the thing, when you're dealing with someone of Combs's stature, someone who's built an empire spanning decades, a verdict doesn't just close a case. It opens up a whole new chapter of legal, financial, and cultural consequences that most people never see coming. Let's break down what actually happened in those final moments. The jury had been deliberating for what felt like an eternity. Legal experts were split on which way this would go. You had seasoned prosecutors who've handled major racketeering cases, saying this was as solid as they come. Then you had defense attorneys with decades of experience, arguing that the prosecution's case was built on a foundation of speculation and opportunistic accusers. But here's where it gets fascinating. The jury wasn't just weighing evidence, they were essentially deciding whether the entertainment industry's culture of excess and power dynamics constitutes criminal behavior. Think about that for a second. These 12 ordinary people had to determine where the line is between wealth, influence, and outright criminality in an industry that thrives on blurring those exact lines. The prosecution's closing arguments painted a picture of systematic abuse and manipulation. They pointed to financial records showing payments that they argued were hush money. They highlighted testimony from multiple accusers who described patterns of coercion and control. Most importantly, they presented those recorded conversations, audio that allegedly captured Combs discussing activities that, if true, would constitute serious federal crimes. But the defense wasn't backing down. They systematically challenged every piece of evidence. They questioned the credibility of witnesses who they claimed had financial incentives to lie. They argued that consensual adult relationships were being reframed as criminal acts years after the fact. And they made a compelling case that their client was being targeted precisely because of his success and prominence. What made this jury's job incredibly difficult was the nature of the evidence itself. Unlike a murder case where you might have DNA evidence or clear physical proof, racketeering and sex trafficking cases often rely heavily on testimony and circumstantial evidence. The jury had to decide who to believe when different witnesses told conflicting stories about the same events. The digital forensic evidence became crucial. Text messages, emails, financial transactions. All of this painted a picture that the prosecution argued showed a pattern of criminal behavior. But the defense countered that the same evidence could be interpreted as standard business practices in the entertainment industry, where NDAs, payments to associates, and complex financial arrangements are completely normal. Then there was the testimony from Combs' inner circle. Some of his closest associates took the stand, and their testimony was absolutely devastating. These weren't random accusers looking for a payday. These were people who had worked with him for years, who had been part of his organization, who had intimate knowledge of how his businesses operated. But here's what really complicated things for the jury. The defense successfully argued that many of these witnesses had their own legal troubles and were potentially testifying in exchange for more lenient treatment from prosecutors. This created a credibility issue that the jury had to wrestle with throughout deliberations. The cultural aspect of this case cannot be understated. The jury had to navigate questions about race, wealth, and power in America. The defense made it clear that they believed their client was being targeted because he was a successful black man who had achieved unprecedented success in industries traditionally dominated by white executives. This wasn't just legal strategy, it was a genuine concern that resonated with many observers of the case. Meanwhile, the prosecution had to prove that this wasn't about success or race, but about criminal behavior that crossed clear legal lines. They argued that wealth and influence don't provide immunity from the law, and that the victims deserved justice regardless of their attacker's status or achievements. The jury's deliberation process itself became a subject of intense speculation. Legal analysts noted that longer deliberations in high-profile cases often indicate a jury that's carefully weighing complex evidence rather than rushing to judgment. Every day that passed without a verdict led to more theories about what the jury might be thinking. What's particularly significant about this case is how it reflects broader cultural shifts around accountability and power. Just a few years ago, cases like this might have been dismissed or settled quietly. But in today's climate, there's an expectation that powerful figures will face the same legal scrutiny as anyone else. The financial implications of the verdict extend far beyond Combs himself. His business empire, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, faced immediate uncertainty. Brand partnerships, licensing deals, and investment opportunities all hung in the balance. The entertainment industry was watching closely because the outcome would signal how seriously the legal system takes allegations of systematic abuse within their ranks. For the victims who testified, the verdict represented something much more personal than legal precedent. These individuals had made the difficult decision to come forward, to relive traumatic experiences in a public forum, and to face intense scrutiny from defense attorneys and the media. Their courage in testifying became a crucial factor in the case's outcome. The jury's decision also had to account for the broader societal impact. High-profile cases like this one send messages about what behavior society will and won't tolerate from its most powerful members. The verdict would inevitably influence how future cases of this nature are prosecuted and defended. As the foreman stood to read the verdict, everyone in that courtroom understood that they were witnessing a moment that would be studied and referenced for years to come. This wasn't just about one person's guilt or innocence. It was about establishing precedents for how the justice system handles cases involving wealth, power, and systematic abuse. The complexity of the charges themselves made the jury's job extraordinarily challenging. Racketeering charges require proving that a criminal enterprise existed and that the defendant participated in it through a pattern of criminal activity. Sex trafficking charges require proving that force, fraud, or coercion was used to compel commercial sex acts. These aren't simple crimes with straightforward evidence. What made this case particularly compelling was how it intersected with broader conversations about consent, power dynamics, and exploitation in the entertainment industry. Now let's dive deeper into what this verdict actually means for the entertainment industry as a whole. Because this isn't just about one man's legal troubles. This is about a fundamental shift in how power operates in Hollywood and the music business. See, here's the thing that most people don't realize. The Combs case represents something way bigger than just another celebrity scandal. We're talking about the complete dismantling of a decades-old system that protected powerful figures through money, influence, and fear. And that system? It's been crumbling for years, but this verdict might just be the final blow that brings the whole thing down. Think about it this way. For decades, the entertainment industry operated on an unspoken rule. If you had enough money, enough connections, and enough influence, you could basically do whatever you wanted. The machine would protect you. Lawyers would make problems disappear. NDAs would silence victims. Media outlets would look the other way. And anyone who tried to speak up, well, they'd find themselves blacklisted, their careers destroyed, their credibility questioned. But something changed. The Me Too movement started it, sure, but what we're seeing now goes way beyond that. We're seeing prosecutors who aren't afraid to take on the biggest names in entertainment. We're seeing juries who aren't starstruck by celebrity status. We're seeing a legal system that's finally treating these cases with the seriousness they deserve. The prosecution's approach in this case was absolutely methodical. They didn't just throw accusations around and hope something would stick. They built a case brick by brick, using financial records, electronic communications, witness testimony, and physical evidence. They showed a pattern of behavior that spanned decades. They demonstrated how money and power were used not just to commit crimes, but to cover them up afterwards. And here's what's really significant about their strategy. They didn't just focus on individual incidents. They painted a picture of an entire enterprise built around facilitating and concealing criminal behavior. The racketeering charges were crucial because they showed this wasn't just about personal misconduct. This was about using a business empire to enable systematic abuse. The defense, for their part, tried every trick in the book. They attacked the credibility of witnesses, claiming they were motivated by money or revenge. They argued that the government was criminalizing consensual adult behavior. They suggested that Combs was being targeted because of his wealth and prominence, painting him as a victim of prosecutorial overreach. But here's where things get interesting. The jury didn't buy it. And that tells us something really important about how public attitudes have shifted. 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, that defense strategy might have worked. Juries might have been more willing to give a powerful celebrity the benefit of the doubt. they might have been more susceptible to arguments about vindictive accusers or government overreach. Not anymore. This jury looked at the evidence and said, we don't care how famous you are. We don't care how much money you have. We don't care how many hit records you've produced. And that shift in attitude, it's absolutely terrifying for other powerful figures in the industry who might have skeletons in their closets. Because if Sean Combs, with all his wealth and influence and legal resources, couldn't beat these charges, what does that say about their own vulnerability? The financial implications alone are staggering. We're talking about civil lawsuits that could reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about the complete collapse of business relationships and partnerships. Record labels, streaming platforms, media companies, they're all going to be scrambling to distance themselves from anything associated with this case. But the cultural impact might be even more significant, because this verdict sends a message that the old rules don't apply anymore. The message that money and power can't buy you immunity from consequences. The message that victims will be believed and their voices will be heard. Now, here's where it gets really complicated. Some people are celebrating this as a victory for justice and accountability. They're seeing it as proof that the system can work, that powerful predators can be brought down, that victims can get justice, even when they're going up against seemingly insurmountable odds. But others are raising concerns about due process and the presumption of innocence. They're worried about the role that social media and public opinion played in this case. They're questioning whether anyone can really get a fair trial in today's climate, especially when the accusations involve sexual misconduct. And you know what? Both sides have valid points. Because while it's absolutely crucial that victims are believed and that powerful predators face consequences, it's also essential that our legal system maintains its commitment to due process and the presumption of innocence. The challenge is figuring out how to balance these competing values. How do we create a system that takes accusations seriously without abandoning the principle that everyone deserves a fair trial? How do we ensure that victims feel safe coming forward without creating an environment where mere accusations can destroy lives? These are the questions that the entertainment industry is grappling with right now. And the Combs verdict is going to influence how those questions get answered. Here's what I think we're going to see in the coming months and years. First, we're going to see more cases like this. Prosecutors are going to be emboldened by this verdict. Second, we're going to see the industry itself undergo major changes. Companies are going to implement stricter policies and procedures. They're going to be more careful about who they do business with. They're going to invest more heavily in compliance and risk management. Third, we're going to see a generational shift in how the industry operates. The old guard, the people who came up in the system where power meant immunity, they're going to find themselves increasingly marginalized. The new generation of industry leaders, they're going to have to operate under completely different rules. But here's the thing that really fascinates me about this case. It's not just about criminal justice or industry accountability. It's about power itself. It's about how power is distributed, how it's exercised, and how it's checked. For decades, the entertainment industry operated as a kind of feudal system. You had these powerful figures at the top who controlled everything: the money, the opportunities, the careers. And if you wanted to succeed, you had to play by their rules. You had to accept their behavior no matter how inappropriate or illegal it might be. But that system is breaking down. And this verdict is both a symptom of that breakdown and a catalyst for further change. Because it shows that even the most powerful figures in the industry aren't untouchable. It shows that there are limits to what money and influence can accomplish. The ripple effects are going to be felt throughout the industry. Other powerful figures are going to be looking over their shoulders, wondering if they're next. Victims are going to be emboldened to come forward. Prosecutors are going to be more aggressive in pursuing these cases. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of broader cultural changes. We're living in an era where traditional power structures are being questioned and challenged, where social media gives victims a platform to tell their stories, where public opinion can be mobilized quickly and effectively. The entertainment industry isn't immune to these broader trends. In fact, it's probably more vulnerable to them than most industries because it depends so heavily on public perception and cultural relevance. So when we look at this verdict, we're not just looking at the end of one man's career, we're looking at the end of an entire era. An era where power meant immunity, where wealth could buy silence, where victims had no recourse against their abusers. The new era that's emerging is going to be very different. It's going to be an era where accountability matters more than influence, where transparency matters more than power, where justice matters more than money. And that's a change that goes far beyond the entertainment industry. Because the principles at stake here, accountability, transparency, justice, they're relevant to every industry, every institution, every aspect of society. The Sean Combs verdict isn't just about one man or one industry. It's about the kind of society we want to live in. It's about the values we want to uphold. It's about the future we want to create. But here's where things get really interesting, and this is something most people aren't talking about. The verdict in the Diddy case isn't just about one man facing justice. It's about what happens next. Because when you pull back the curtain on a system that's been operating in the shadows for decades, you don't just expose one person's crimes. You expose the entire network that made it possible. Think about it. Sean Combs didn't operate in a vacuum. The allegations that came to light during this trial painted a picture of a vast ecosystem of enablers, facilitators, and silent witnesses. Record executives who looked the other way, security teams who helped cover tracks, financial institutions that processed suspicious transactions, legal teams that made problems disappear, media outlets that buried stories, and countless others who knew exactly what was happening but chose to stay quiet. Now that the verdict is in, the real question becomes, what happens to all these people? Because here's the thing about criminal enterprises, they rarely operate with just one person at the top. There are always layers, always networks, always people who played essential roles in keeping the machine running. And when federal prosecutors build a case this comprehensive, they don't just stop at the main target. They use that conviction as a foundation to build bigger cases. We're already seeing the ripple effects. Sources close to the investigation are saying that federal agents have been quietly reaching out to dozens of individuals who were mentioned in testimony or appeared in evidence. Some are being offered deals to cooperate. Others are being told they're under investigation themselves. The phone calls are happening. The meetings are taking place. The pressure is mounting. And it's not just about criminal liability. We're talking about civil lawsuits that could reshape entire industries. When you have a federal conviction backed by mountains of evidence, that becomes the foundation for civil cases that could result in damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Record labels, venues, security companies, management firms. Anyone who had a business relationship with Combs during the period covered by these charges is now looking at potential legal exposure. But there's something even bigger happening here, and it's about the culture of silence that has protected powerful predators for generations. The entertainment industry has always operated on an unspoken code. You don't talk about what you see. You don't question what you hear. You don't investigate what you suspect. That code has been the foundation of how business gets done in Hollywood, in music, in entertainment as a whole. This verdict shatters that code. It sends a message that silence is no longer protection, that looking the other way is no longer a viable strategy, that the old rules don't apply anymore. And that's terrifying for a lot of people who have built their careers on maintaining those old rules. The psychological impact of this verdict on the industry cannot be overstated. Right now, there are executives sitting in boardrooms, agents fielding phone calls, and publicists crafting statements, all asking themselves the same question. What did I know and when did I know it? Because the standard for accountability has fundamentally changed. The line between willful ignorance and complicity has been redrawn. We're already seeing the behavioral changes. Industry events are being canceled. Business partnerships are being quietly dissolved. NDAs are being revisited by legal teams. Security protocols are being overhauled. The entire ecosystem is reorganizing itself around a new reality where the old protections no longer exist. And it's not just about the entertainment industry. This verdict is being watched closely by people in sports, politics, business, and every other sector where power and influence have traditionally provided immunity from consequences. The message is clear. The rules have changed, and no one is too big to fall. The technology aspect of this case is also worth examining. The evidence that brought down Combs included digital communications, financial records, and electronic surveillance that would have been impossible to gather and analyze just a few years ago. Federal investigators now have tools that can track money flows, communications, and movements with unprecedented precision. The digital footprint that powerful people leave behind is massive, and it's all admissible in court. This creates a new calculus for anyone operating in the gray areas of legality. Every text message, every email, every financial transaction, every phone call, every location ping from a mobile device. It's all being recorded and it's all potentially discoverable. The days of conducting business through winks and nods and handshake agreements are over. Everything leaves a trail now. The international implications are significant too. Many of the activities described in the trial took place across state lines and international borders. This wasn't just a local operation, it was a global network that involved multiple jurisdictions and required coordination between law enforcement agencies in different countries. Borders. But perhaps the most profound impact of this verdict is on the victims and survivors who found the courage to come forward. For decades, the prevailing wisdom was that powerful people like Sean Combs were untouchable, that the system would protect them, that speaking out would only result in retaliation and revictimization. This verdict proves that's no longer true. The courage it took for these victims to testify, to relive their trauma in public, to face cross-examination and media scrutiny, cannot be overstated. They didn't just seek justice for themselves, they created a pathway for future victims to come forward. They proved that the system can work when people are willing to speak truth to power. And that's perhaps the most important legacy of this case. Not just the conviction of one man, but the empowerment of countless others who have been silenced by fear, intimidation, and a system that prioritized protecting the powerful over protecting the vulnerable. The verdict doesn't just deliver justice. Now, when we zoom out and look at the bigger picture here, what we're really witnessing is something that goes way beyond just one high-profile trial. This case represents a fundamental shift in how justice operates in America, especially when it comes to the powerful and the connected. For decades, we've seen a pattern where wealth, influence, and celebrity status acted as shields, protecting certain individuals from facing real consequences for their actions. But that shield just got shattered, and the implications are massive. The entertainment industry, in particular, has operated under this unspoken code of silence for far too long. We've seen glimpses of it before with other high-profile cases, but this verdict sends a crystal-clear message that times have changed. The old system where powerful figures could buy their way out of accountability, where victims were silenced through intimidation and legal maneuvering, where enablers looked the other way because it was profitable to do so, that system is crumbling before our eyes. What's fascinating is how this case has exposed the entire machinery that kept these operations running. We're talking about a network of enablers, from personal assistants who arranged logistics, to security personnel who enforced silence, to legal teams who crafted NDAs, to business associates who turned blind eyes to obvious red flags. The prosecution didn't just go after the main perpetrator, they systematically dismantled the entire support structure that made these crimes possible. This is where things get really interesting from a legal perspective. The RICO charges weren't just about individual acts of wrongdoing. They were about proving that an entire organization existed for criminal purposes. That's a much higher bar to clear, but it's also a much more powerful tool for prosecutors. When you can prove that someone's entire business empire was essentially a criminal enterprise, you're not just punishing individual crimes. You're dismantling the infrastructure that enabled those crimes to happen systematically over years or even decades. The evidence that came out during this trial was absolutely staggering. We're talking about financial records that traced payments to victims, digital communications that showed clear coordination of criminal activities, witness testimonies that painted a picture of systematic abuse and coercion. But perhaps most damning were the recordings, the digital evidence that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as he said, she said situations. This wasn't a case built on shaky ground. This was a fortress of evidence that the defense simply couldn't tear down. What's also remarkable is how this case has changed the conversation around consent and power dynamics. The prosecution successfully argued that when someone has that level of power over others, when they control careers, financial security, and social standing, true consent becomes impossible. This isn't just about physical coercion, it's about economic coercion, social coercion, and the abuse of power relationships. That's a legal principle that's going to have ripple effects far beyond this case. The victims in this case showed incredible courage, and their willingness to come forward despite knowing they'd face intense scrutiny and potential retaliation was crucial to securing this conviction. For years, many of these victims stayed silent, not because they didn't want justice, but because they knew the system was rigged against them. They knew that speaking out could mean career suicide, legal battles they couldn't afford, and personal attacks designed to destroy their credibility. But something shifted in recent years. The cultural moment we're living in, where survivors are finally being believed, where institutions are being held accountable, where the cost of silence has become greater than the cost of speaking out, created an environment where these victims felt they could finally step forward. And when they did, their stories corroborated each other in ways that made the pattern of abuse undeniable. The defense strategy in this case was predictable but ultimately ineffective. They tried to paint the victims as opportunistic. They tried to argue that any interactions were consensual. They tried to separate individual incidents from the broader pattern of behavior. But when you're facing RICO charges, individual incidents don't matter as much as the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise. The prosecution was able to show that this wasn't just a series of unrelated bad decisions. This was a coordinated, long-term criminal operation. One of the most significant aspects of this case is how it's going to change corporate culture and due diligence processes. Companies are already scrambling to review their partnerships, their endorsement deals, their business relationships. The legal concept of willful blindness, where organizations claim they didn't know about criminal behavior that was happening right under their noses, is becoming much harder to maintain as a defense. Boards of directors, business partners, and corporate executives are realizing that they can't just turn a blind eye to obvious red flags and expect to avoid legal consequences. The financial implications are staggering too. We're not just talking about criminal penalties, we're talking about civil lawsuits that could run into the hundreds of millions of dollars. When you have this level of criminal conviction, it makes civil cases much easier to win. Victims who might have struggled to prove their cases in civil court now have a criminal conviction that establishes the pattern of abuse and the criminal nature of the enterprise. What's particularly interesting is how this case has highlighted the role of social media and digital communications in modern criminal investigations. The evidence that proved most damaging wasn't just traditional documents or witness testimony. It was text messages, social media posts, digital financial transactions, and electronic communications that created an undeniable paper trail. In today's digital age, it's becoming increasingly difficult for criminals to operate without leaving digital footprints that can be traced and used as evidence. The international implications of this case are also significant. Many of the alleged crimes involved international travel, and the prosecution was able to use federal trafficking laws that carry severe penalties. This sends a message to other high-profile individuals that they can't just flee to jurisdictions with more favorable laws or less rigorous enforcement. The reach of federal law enforcement, especially when it comes to trafficking and organized crime, extends far beyond national borders. Looking at the broader cultural impact, this case represents a generational shift in how we think about power, accountability, and justice. Younger generations who have grown up with social media and digital transparency have fundamentally different expectations about accountability than previous generations. They expect powerful figures to be held to high standards, they expect transparency in business dealings, and they expect consequences when those standards are violated. The media coverage of this case has also been fascinating to watch. Unlike previous high-profile cases where media coverage sometimes focused more on celebrity gossip than on the serious criminal allegations, this case has been covered with the gravity it deserves. The focus has been on the victims, the evidence, and the broader implications for justice, rather than on sensationalism or celebrity culture. This verdict also represents a victory for prosecutors who have been working to build cases against powerful figures for years. It shows that with sufficient evidence, proper legal strategy, and victims willing to come forward, even the most well-connected defendants can be held accountable. That's going to encourage other prosecutors to pursue similar cases, and it's going to encourage other victims to come forward with their own stories. The ripple effects of this case are going to be felt for years to come. We're already seeing other investigations being launched, other victims coming forward, and other powerful figures being scrutinized more closely. This case has created a template for how to successfully prosecute complex criminal enterprises involving powerful individuals, and that template is going to be used again and again. What we're witnessing here is nothing short of a transformation in how justice works in America. The old system where wealth and power provided immunity from consequences is dying, and a new system based on evidence, accountability, and justice for all is taking its place. This case will be remembered as a turning point, a moment when the scales of justice finally balanced properly, regardless of who was standing on either side. The message is clear. No one is above the law, no matter how powerful, how wealthy, or how connected they might be. Justice, real justice, is finally within reach for everyone,